In the moment, it was erected during the unnerving summer of 1941, the so-called Schwerbelastungskörper, heavy load-bearing cylinder, which you see here, an earth-penetrating test load left behind by the National Socialists in Berlin-Tempelhof, has embodied the dialectic of culture and barbarity that defines fascist German modernity and probably human civilization in general, like no other object in history. The massive ferroconcrete cylinder stands at 46 feet tall, has a diameter of 69 feet, and weighs over 12,650 tons, which is more than the Eiffel Tower in Paris, the Statue of Liberty in New York, and the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro combined. It even outweighs the probably heaviest structure ever built, the Cheops Pyramid, in terms of soil pressure. Underneath the cylinder are measurement chambers and instruments that go as deep as 60 feet underground. Drilling through the upper layer of Berlin's iconic Märkischer Sand, mark sand, the cylinder weighs heavily upon a layer of Geschiebemergel, glacial till. The latter is a highly heterogeneous soil type that contains all grain sizes from fine sands to giant boulders and was still untested as building ground during those days. Would it be able to carry all this weight? The emerging heaviest age was accumulating. To explore this question and collect data for an appropriate foundation design, Hitler's favorite architect, Albert Speer, ordered the cylinder to prepare for the construction of history's largest triumphal arch as part of the projected transformation of Berlin into the neoclassical capital of the world, Germania. Speer supersized Germania plans capitalized on forced labor, appropriation, deportation, large-scale demolition, and they were deeply tied into the network of concentration camps that were to provide the vast human and material resources necessary to build on such a super-historical scale. Enormous masses of slave laborers, bricks, concrete, steel, and natural stones. The ambition was to trump the entire canon of classical architecture and build a city greater than ancient Rome or any other imperial capital in world history to mark the triumph of German Blut und Boden, blood and soil. Well, the slides are not. Oh, there we go. Okay. Quote, what Hitler, Speer, and the entire army of National Socialist architects built was a weighty imperial structure with fortresses along its borders and a heavy solid core in its metropolitan center that promised unlimited expansion, but within a framework of extraordinary stability, a country made of stone, unquote. This is by a professor in the German department who wrote this book that I encourage you to read. So, without a doubt, a heavy shadow is still hanging upon Faust metropolis, as Alexandra Ritchie famously referred to Berlin. Let us begin our journey through the sediments of time and the soils and unpack it from the bottom up. Faust's notorious desire to amass countless bodies of knowledge to understand the mechanics of the earth, dass ich erkenne, was die Welt im Innersten zusammenhält. Here the translation, so that I may understand what holds the world together in its deepest ends, went hand in hand with the will to take absolute control over the same mechanics, a process that accelerated rapidly during modernity with the advent of technological progress. Mother Earth, Gretchen, and Shulamit were to be collateral damage of this ruthless pursuit of knowledge and power that led mankind into the deepest ends of Earth and later the cosmos. This giant chisel that you see on the photograph here stands as a symbol for the overarching penetration of deep space. It was used to bore into the soils underneath Berlin into a depth of over 1,600 feet during the late 1930s, when geotechnical engineers, heavily funded by Speer, started a large-scale vertical measuring of the world that prepared a massification of the world in terms of size, weight, and density of the proliferating urban spaces. Just as a side note, the deepest man-made borehole was conducted by the Soviet Union, the so-called Kola super deep borehole reached a depth of over 40,000 feet in 1979. The deepest penetration of the cosmos so far is being conducted by NASA's Webb telescope that is located about 1 million miles away from Earth, where it orbits the sun and zooms into space. It was launched in 2021, and former University of Michigan professor Thomas Surbuchen was one of the scientific directors. But let's not go that deep. Instead, let's take a look at a soil sample taken from underneath the cylinder. So, these file cards depict pieces of German soil, or do they? Well, these pieces of earth were without a doubt withdrawn within the borders of the so-called Greater German Empire in 1941, using the soil mechanical technique of boring through a layer of sand into a depth of about 60 feet. Has it always been in that location? Not quite. As the file card details, it is a piece of Geschiebemergel, glacial till, and as the word Geschiebe, that which pushes or is being pushed, suggests, it arrived at this location in Berlin's glacial valley through the act of a glacier pushing it across Europe. Or better, it was forged by the friction between the glacier's mass and the landscapes it was breaching through until it came to a halt at the end of the last ice age about 11,700 years ago. As a result, it contains all grain sizes from fine sands to giant boulders. On February 10th, 1940, geoengineer Heinz Moos described the violent creation of glacial soils as, I read in German, here's the English translation, mechanische Zertrümmerung durch Spaltenfrost und gegenseitiger Zerschmirgelung beim Transport in den Schmelzwässern. So, where does this little piece of land belong then? Obviously, soil as a material predates the category of Germanness, into which it was later on embedded in the context of Blut und Boden, blood and soil ideology during German fascism that drew a parallel between the purity of race and cultivation of soil. In Building in the German Empire from 1938, Gerdi Trost, wife of fascist architect Paul Ludwig Trost, the predecessor of Albert Speer, wrote, I read in German again, you can read in English. Menschen deutschen Blutes haben aus Steppe und Urwald fruchtbare Felder geschaffen und haben immer und überall in der Welt ihrer inneren Veranlagung gemäß die Urlandschaft gestaltet und sind fest im Boden verwurzelt. We see here that she emphasizes the apparent timelessness of the relationship between race and soil. Primeval forest, primeval landscapes, always, everywhere. So when looking at space, time, and identity through the narrow lens of a human lifespan, soil can become a spatio-temporal identitarian marker, as we all know. Sarah Ahmed described how the imaginary of a stable nation can trigger collective feelings against the other as a threat to the groundedness of the nation as an object of love that requires a passionate defense against any contaminants that would disrupt its purity. So altogether, this particular piece of soil that I'm looking at, which was withdrawn here. So this red thing is the cylinder. Was part of a Geschichte. So that which is layering or being layered, also the German word for story and history. And a Geschiebe, as I already mentioned, that which is pushing or being pushed, but most of all, it was part of a Gewichte, so that which is weighing or being weighed upon. Because the reason it was being examined was because geotechnical engineers, in anticipation of Speer's monumental building plans that featured history's heaviest buildings, wanted to test how much weight this layer of soil can take without crumbling. So these world wonders were supposed to embody the racial superiority of the Aryans by creating the illusion of absolute monumentality, eternity, and purity. And accordingly, the ground, which is naturally a highly heterogeneous construct, was to be prepared to be able to carry these eternal erections as metonymies of the to-be purified body of the nation. These fantasies of purity were built upon the concept of the other, whose role in the fascist world design it was to, quote, embody the danger of impurity or the mixing or taking of blood. They threaten to violate the pure bodies. Thus, mixed race couplings and immigration become readable as forms of rape or molestation, an invasion of the body of the nation, unquote. Again, Sarah Ahmed. But when we, just like geotechnical engineers, look into the body of the Earth and measure out its layered but disruptive properties, we must recognize the lack of a clear order makes it almost impossible to determine a finite spatio-temporal, stratigraphical, chronological order of the soil. And echoing this, classifying the soil is equally difficult as the different soil types constantly invade and flow into each other, as we will see. So, in a preliminary report about the topic of deep drillings as important tool for the transformation of Berlin in 1939, Dr. Mautz, a geologist, raved about the promising nature of this project for science and the construction world. And he provided a few observations based on a drilling profile printed in the report. So these are drilling profiles. This particular drilling profile is based on a 1,600 feet deep drilling at the Kolonnenbrücke, which is a bridge close to the cylinder. And it also informed its construction process. In an initial distant reading, Mautz breaks down the drilling profile by unpacking the larger spatio-temporal frame it is structured by. So the geological soil layers, alluvium, diluvium, tertiary, and Oligocene, they reach millions and millions of years deep. From there, he breaks down each of these four larger time frames and closer readings. I want to pick out his reading of the diluvium, an archaic word for ice age, as it was the layer relevant for the construction of the cylinder and for constructions in Berlin in general. So I quote a passage which I find quite insightful, almost poetic, in the way it unpacks the dynamic structure of soil. And you also have the passage there in translation. Wie aus den Profilen eindeutig hervorgeht, or I'll read in English actually. What is apparent on the profiles is that the layer composition and thickness of the diluvial sediments fluctuate heavily. Till, slip rock horizons, gravel, sand, silt, and clay alternate in colorful diversity or intermesh, and even for the geologist, it is hard to figure out the chronological order. The drilling profile demonstrates, in the most impressive way, the extreme fluctuation of the border between the diluvium and the tertiary. Often one has to oppose the layman's belief that the border proceeds vertical and is planar, which one could hope for in a certain depth. How uncertain the course of the border yet is becomes clear only through the few profiles presented here, and this fact can be borne out with many more examples. So what is immediately apparent in the narrative that the geologist provides about the structure of soil is the limitation of his knowledge. His analytical gaze is confronted with the lack of a clear internal and external structural order. Internally, each soil layer fluctuates in terms of material composition, consists various types of soil, making each layer a highly heterogeneous construct. Externally, the vertical and horizontal expansion of each soil layer varies as well, while the different layers mix with each other. And as literary scholar Mark McGurl puts it, quote, what we call the ground is no ground at all, but the result of a process whose own ground is another antecedent process extending backward in time, unquote. So it appears that soil, in the way it is programmed, transcends categorical thinking in terms of rigid soil identities or spatial and temporal borders towards an inherent conceptual fluidity, providing a counter-narrative to what Speer's monuments try to tell us. So, if we decide to peel away the layer of soil as marker of nationhood and dig even deeper into the space-time continuum, we shall see about 14 billion years ago, this tiny piece of soil was contained within a tiny pinhead with the rest of all matter that now exists in the universe, if we follow the most common cosmological theory of the Big Bang. An extension to this theory, the Big Bounce, proclaims that once our universe has reached its state of maximum expansion, it will contract again, from where it will expand again, forming an eternal pulse. The contracted state or universe would be absolutely inclusive. It literally contains all possible times, spaces, and beings. This distant reading of mine also demonstrates to you how related geology and cosmology, so going down and going up to the bottom and to the top, are despite their inverted constellation. The inward journey is always interstellar. When we look at the world like this, standpoint epistemology, being racially rooted in the soil, loses all of its meaning. There's no truth to pinpoint and nothing to stand upon, neither physically nor metaphysically, a very Nietzschean perspective. And as a side note, I talked about the Big Bounce theory briefly with David on our retreat. And he also likes the theory because it has this kind of redemptive, eternal quality. But it seems like, and this is why I included 4 different possible outcomes. It seems like the data now is mostly supporting the theory of what I would say is the big rip. So astrophysicists discovered this dark energy that leads the universe to expand faster and faster and faster until it goes up in flames. But I prefer to believe in the Big Bounce, which is also supported by people like Roger Penrose, who got a Nobel Prize for astrophysics. But, well, there's a plurality of possible ends. But now, enough of metaphysics. Because it appears, nevertheless, that belonging to something, to a piece of land, to a group, to landscapes, is an illusion that humans need to cling onto in order to feel connected to something, at least. Maybe it's an illusion, but a necessary illusion that one needs to maintain a sense of purpose in life, something to hold on to in order not to drown in the streams of endlessness, which is an inevitable consequence when we recognize that every sheltering truth is just a fragile construction built on flowing water, as Nietzsche described it. The project of fascism was deeply informed by this existential fear, I suspect, of this fear of instability, but instead of embracing it, they try to artificially stop the natural fluidity of spaces, times, and identities, and try to keep up an illusion of stability, purity, and so on at all costs. And now really enough of metaphysics. So on March 4th, 1939, Albert Speer, in his function as Generalbauinspektor für die Neugestaltung der Reichshauptstadt, so General Building Inspector for the redevelopment of the capital of the Reich, short GBI, addressed the foundation of the Triumphal Arch at the square at the Kolonnenbrücke in a letter. The project was based on a drawing by Hitler from the 1920s, which you can see here, and apparently was planned with gigantic proportions. So our Triumphal Arch with 160 meters, over 500 feet width, 119 meters, almost 400 feet depth, and almost 400 feet height would have towered above all buildings by far and virtually degraded them by scale. So in order to prepare the soil for such heaviness, Speer listed the ground examinations required prior to the planned construction of this gigantic gate to Germania that was planned as the major entrance point. So here's this letter. So first, geological plans. Second, foundation depths. Third, foundation process. Fourth, the possibilities of including the subway into the foundation. And 5, the weight procedures. So all of these matters were concerned with what structural engineers refer to as substructure. So the load-bearing elements of a building, including the foundations and the soil that ultimately carries everything. The loading parts of a building are correspondingly referred to as superstructure. In order to maintain a long-lasting architectural erection, the weight of the superstructure mustn't exceed the load-bearing capacity of the substructure. Otherwise, unwanted tensions and movements will occur. Just think of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, eventually leading to collapse. To avoid this, Speer delegated the task of keeping it up to the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Bodenmechanik, German Society for Soil Mechanics. Essentially, the field of soil mechanics, a hybrid of geology and civil engineering, established as its own academic discipline fairly recently in 1925. It examines from the bottom up how different types of soil react to pressure applied by buildings from the top down. And it also informs the development of technologies to increase load-bearing capacities. To sum it up, major tasks are foundation building, soil modification. And while the designs of the architects, who mostly take all the credit, are visible to the public eye, the foundational effort of the geotechnical engineer remains largely unnoticed, even if no building can stand without their expertise, especially not heavier ones like the arch. And as a matter of fact, we do have a department of soil mechanics and foundation engineering here on campus as well, which you might know or might not know. So, all right, to put this in perspective, let me provide you with some historical context. So without geotechnical engineers, this is how the world looks like. So early 20th century marked a moment in history in which human building activity had reached a scale that became literally unbearable for the planet, which caused quite a rough awakening. The unprecedented rate and geographical expansion of construction endeavors struggled with catastrophic damage caused by soil movement. For example, in one case, the slippage of a railway cutting caused a cost explosion from 50,000 to over 1 million Reichsmark in Oberschlesien. The increasing weight of gigantic modern buildings, such as train stations, dams, dockyards, exacerbated the problem. This urgency called for the discipline of soil mechanics to emerge, with the heavy load-bearing cylinder as its masterpiece. The cylinder is part of the tradition of test loading, more specifically, which is equally an engineering cultural practice, motivated by the basic human desire for structural stability as guarantor of a sense of security. We need to believe that a house does not collapse on top of our heads in order to feel safe. This looks good. The early humans tested the tear resistance of vines or the load capacity of tree branches by applying pressure to them in the most primitive fashion. Or like this. This is 1905. So builders forwarded this hands-on knowledge about their craft over generations. In the 19th and early 20th century, theoretical approaches were still mostly unavailable, and test loading kept playing a key role in gaining the trust of the public, especially regarding new materials and construction techniques. To give another example, October 1937, 84 trucks and 28 streetcars filled with stones were positioned on top of the Bridge of the Reich in Vienna over the span of 3 days. And even if the measurements of building sinkage or material elasticity conducted during these tests were generally of rather limited value for predictions in terms of long-lasting stability, given its symbolic power, test loading continued to play a crucial role. Within the larger history of test loading, the heavy load-bearing cylinder occurred as a flagship of a new, highly advanced generation that was designed to respond to the very recent problem of soil movement. Instead of testing the durability of a building or a specific building material, engineers examined the loadability of soil. By simulating the exact weight of the Triumphal Arch, a building of unprecedented weight, the engineers enabled a detailed documentation of the soil's reaction, as no such data existed yet. And Speer actually mentioned the cylinder in his memoirs. And in order to ascertain that our calculations about the sinking depths of a few centimeters in the Markstein were right, we produced a test piece in Berlin. It is, with the exception of a few drawings and model photographs, the only remaining witness of this edifice. And here you see how it goes underground. So this is above the ground, is underground. So the fact that a few centimeters, it were precisely 5 centimeters, which is about 2 inches, where the limits of this movement underscores the fragility of gigantic buildings towards micro soil movements. The reason for this susceptibility was the desired aesthetic of eternity, signified by the natural stone cladding that was to be applied on the ferroconcrete core of Speer's monuments. This mix of ancient and modern materials was the only way to build on such a scale, but complicated the building process as both materials sink differently, which leads to tensions between them. And as the reports of the engineers reflect, Speer therefore had extraordinarily strict requirements and practically wanted to nullify soil movement in order to avoid any potential damage on his monuments. This determined the need for highly precise soil measuring methods that did not exist yet. And the cylinder filled this insecurity gap as probably the heaviest and technologically most sophisticated test load ever conducted. And despite its uniqueness, the cylinder was part of a much larger measuring project called Baugrundkarte, sub-grade soil map, that was initiated by Speer and ran from 1938 to 1941. The goal was to create a map that was supposed to document the soil properties of Berlin in its entirety, and to visualize the locally varying load-bearing capacities of soil for construction engineers. This project was the foundational research for transformation plans to Berlin, and the new scale of heaviness required a new depth of soil examinations. And center of this project were thousands of deep drillings into Berlin soil, reaching a depth of over 1,600 feet in some cases, accompanied by the collection and analysis of 10,000s of soil samples. Meanwhile, methods of soil condensation were explored to increase its loadability. Based on the collected data, the individual soil layers of Berlin were mapped out, providing the data necessary for anticipating soil movement and explore ways of controlling it. The results were regularly reported to Speer. The project, though, was never finished. It was later on abandoned when the war turned, but the data remained remarkably important, not only for the reconstruction of Berlin, ironically. To sum it up, the striving for excessive size, intended as a signifier of eternal structural stability, led to an extraordinary fragility of fascist constructions and made things a lot more complicated. The technocratic approach to solve this problem did nevertheless produce an excessive amount of data that was foundational for the modern world. Let us ask then, what was feeding this drive towards the infinite, and what can we learn from it about fascism and inhumanity? How is the relationship between superstructure and substructure of a monument reflected in the fascist design of a society based on binary hierarchical oppositions? Let us allow the architect to expose himself and his cylinder. So Speer said, "For a great building, I would have sold my soul like Faust. At that moment, I had found my Mephisto. He seemed no less appealing than the one of Goethe." Size mattered for Speer. On countless occasions, in his writings, speeches, and interviews, he raved about how his planned buildings would have outsized anything in history. Even decades after the war, he maintained the stance that the scale of projects is not an argument against them, despite current opinion. A fascination for hugeness is expressed in the Tower of Babel, the Egyptian pyramids, the buildings of Olympia, the temples of Selenon, the Colosseum in Rome, whether they present the power of a state, individual will, a symbol of faith, or a demonstration of technical skill. The seven wonders of the world were selected more for their size than for their aesthetic merit. That a monument's value resides in its size is a belief basic to mankind, unquote. Speer shared this obsession with Hitler, his proclaimed Mephisto. As a matter of fact, they were way closer to each other. It was a topic they bonded over and a major pillar of their friendship. For Hitler, the major function of monuments was to compare the size, the hardness, and the endurance of one's own nationhood with others. Quote, "The biggest was to glorify one's work, to boost one's self-confidence," unquote. The size of the monuments was to reflect the scale of the imperial ambitions Hitler stated in that regard. As world capital, Berlin will only be comparable with ancient Egypt, Babylon, and Rome. What is London? What is Paris compared to that? Unquote. And Speer admitted. Likewise, I was intoxicated by the idea of having created historical witnesses in stone with the help of drawings, money, and construction companies, and thus being able to anticipate a 1,000-year-long claim also intoxicated me to have beaten historically outstanding buildings, at least on the scale, with the idea of one's own greatness projected into eternity. These buildings were intentionally planned as a projection of one's own desired size, as we can see. They were to be a kind of super historical Viagra that allowed Hitler and Speer to stay up and on top for eternity, within this competition of comparing one's personal greatness and national superiority with others that were to be dwarfed in comparison, a long-lasting triumph to be embodied by the eternal erections of the massive monuments they planned to leave behind. So a thinker called Klaus Teleweit actually offered a quite insightful analysis of the fascist soldier hypermasculine desire to stay up and stay hard. He argued that, quote, the soldierly man freezes in front of erotic femininity, becomes an icicle, unquote, and thus keeps himself, quote, together as a whole, as a body with rigid borders, as which he would cease to exist with the touch of an erotic woman, unquote. And here the longer quote, he defends himself with a type of permanent erection of the whole body, entire cities, whole troop units. If it is the man himself, a city, a rock, a border, critical for the defense against the flood is the towering, unquote. And interesting enough, as Klaus Teleweit also writes, contemporary psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich, quote, reports from clinical practice that soldiers indeed frequently suffered from permanent erections, unquote. As Teleweit interprets this, the deep-seated fear is to lose one's identity to the female flood, which is then overcompensated by an enforced erection of the body, the city and the troops which stand as a wall to defend one's fragile ego and identity against the invasion of the fluid forces. Given the natural fluidity of things in the cosmos, where energy is transformed into matter and vice versa, and nothing ever stands still in the grand scheme of things, we can expose these fascist fantasies of eternal erections as an overcompensation for the deep-seated fear of transformativity, hybridity, fluidity, and so on. Purity. Well, not that was the overcompensation, of course. So their formula to nevertheless reach immortality, at least on a narrative level, was then immortality, eternity, purity. Their space had to be monumental, their history eternal, and their race pure. And the architectural erections had to be the biggest, the longest lasting, and their seamen the purest, of course. So this is how they envisioned themselves. Muscular, white, blonde, blue-eyed, heroic, the Muskelmann, muscle man. This relief that you here see in the middle of the newspaper article, Vergeltung, Revenge, is by Arno Breker, one of the leading sculptors of the fascist period and a good friend of Speer, of course, was to be chiseled into the pillars of the Triumphal Arch. Here you can see it a little better. For Hitler's 50th birthday on April 30th, 1939, Speer gifted him a large-scale model of the said Triumphal Arch. The names of all the 1.8 German soldiers that had died on the battlefields during World War I were to be chiseled into its granite plates to mark their heroic place in history above all future Germania visitors looking up to them, reminding them of their own duties for the German Empire. They were declared superhuman. No word was to be lost about the millions of people declared subhuman who had died in the concentration camps and on the construction sites, cutting, carrying, and assembling the stones and other materials of the world's largest monuments. While they were supposed to embody the triumph of German blood and soil, the amount of blood that poured from the workers' bodies onto the German soil and the stones of the buildings was supposed to be forgotten and washed away. More than anything, the size of Speer's building plans reflect the scale of the mass production of corpses caused by the NS movement. So let's transition from Muskelman, muscle man, to Muselmann, from the heavy load-bearing cylinder to the heavy load-bearing bodies of the workers, from Baukörper, built bodies, and Körperbau, body built, to building bodies. So who gave this anonymized, to be erased mass a powerful voice were survivors like Primo Levi. Quote, we are the slaves of the slaves, whom all can give orders to, and our name is the number which we carry tattooed on our arm and soon on our jacket, unquote. His words capture the essence of building Germania from the perspective of the workers that Speer remained largely silent about, namely the dehumanization of bauende Körper, building bodies, so sweating, bleeding, suffering, and bearing bodies. They were degraded into material resources for the Baukörper, built bodies, buildings, thus carrying numbers, not names, forced to leave their spirits in the stones. For the likes of Speer, camp laborers were like his cylinder, that they were just mute parts of an overarching world design. Their role in history was to bear his architectural vision and suffer peacefully. To give them their role back, we need to look at them as the actual heavy load-bearing bodies, schwer belastete Körper, carrying the weight of history, the foundation of heavy load-bearing modernity, resting heavily upon their tormented shoulders. It was their blood that soaked the German soil. In the following passage, Levi described a building that was towering above its surroundings, just like the arch was supposed to, namely a factory chimney in Auschwitz, born out of the same spirit as Speer's Germania and built by the same hands. Quote, the carbide tower, it's also here, which rises in the middle of Buna and whose top is rarely visible in the fog, was built by us. Its bricks were called Ziegel bricks, Tegula, Zegli, Kameni, Matoni, Teglak, and they were cemented by hate and discord, like the Tower of Babel. And it is this that we call it, Babelturm, Bobelturm, and in it we hate the insane dream of grandeur of our master, the contempt for us men, unquote. So Levi described this insane dream of grandeur captured in the biblical tower motif, reminiscing Fritz Lang's technocratic vision of a vertically segregated city under total control as something physical, something material, something that, quote, we all feel and the Germans themselves feel, that a curse, not transcendent and divine, but inherent and historical, hangs over the insolent buildings based on the confusion of languages and erected in defiance of heaven like a stone oath, unquote. So this building as a metonymy for Auschwitz, this chimney and fascist biopolitics, not only protruded vertically out of the spatial confines of the camp, symbolically it protruded out of the timeline of history itself, marking the most violent event that ever occurred. In the cylinder, both Speer's arch as a vehicle of mass mobilization of superhumans sent off to the battlefields, and the chimney as a symbol of mass destruction of so-called subhumans sent off to the crematoria reflect themselves, come together, forging the a priori of Germania, fed by the most destructive and most creative capacities of humanity, marking the heaviest monument in human history, unbearable, prone to sink deep into our collective memory like columns of ashes raining down on burning German landscapes, eventually falling onto the ground and sinking into the soils with the next rainfall. So while Speer was concerned with how many inches his big cylinder was to sink into the soil, to uphold his fantasy of an eternal erection, sinking for the workers in the concentration camp had a very different meaning. In Auschwitz, as Levi wrote, quote, to sink is the easiest of matters. It is enough to carry out all the orders one receives, to eat only the ration, to observe the discipline of the work in the camp, unquote. Those who sink without resistance, a group he famously called Muselmänner, have given up on their life and will sink deeper and deeper into a pitch black hole. Those who sank became, quote, the Muselmänner, the drowned, who form the backbone of the camp, an anonymous mass, continually renewed and always identical, of non-men who march and labor in silence, already too empty to really suffer, unquote. They are the totgeschwiegen, hushed up foundation of Germania, sunken into the soils and oblivion, but who were designated to carry this history of eternal suffering on their shoulders. And this weight was inscribed in their bloodlines that trickled into the grounds of the camps. Speer was one of those German masters of death, shouting, quote, thrust deeper into the soil, quote, as he conducted a death fugue of gigantic proportions in which the workers were supposed to drown while carving the architect's greatness into stone. Heavy load-bearing modernity was resting heavily on their shoulders. And unlike the cold and analytical fascist gales on soil, the concentration camp workers had a far more intimate relationship with the ground, thus creating a new map of blood and soil. After getting off the train, going through the selection, being stripped of their families, friends, belongings, clothing, hair, names, dignity, and humanity, they realized Auschwitz is not a place on this earth, as they lacked words to describe it. Quote, our language lacks words to express this offense, the demolition of a man, and they knew we had reached the bottom. It is not possible to sink lower than this, unquote. The man formerly known as Primo Levi was transformed into Häftling, prisoner number 174,517, and left behind as a shell of himself, a hollow man, as he called it. Levi grasped the, quote, double sense of the term extermination camp, unquote, during these initiation rituals of the camps for the first time, quote, double, unquote, because what occurred first was the initial conceptual extermination executed by the hollowing out of the human. This procedure set them free for the second physical annihilation, which disposed of the emptied bodies, as he described it. Correspondingly, the body, as the only vehicle of biological survival, became the constant object of inquiry next to the topography and the societal mechanics of the camp to which the body was navigating through. Only the proper maintenance of the human apparatus could ensure one manages to stay on the side of the saved and not join the drowned. These two beings coexisted but were split by an invisible border that divided the inmates of the camps into two groups that lived in the same place but in different worlds. As Levi described it, the annihilation of humanness, the systematic demolition of the body, the acting out of the logic ingrained in the superstructure of the camp begun. Topographically, this space was clearly confined. Quote, our lager is a square of about 600 yards in length, surrounded by two fences of barbed wire, the inner one carrying a high-tension current, unquote. Within these confines, there were accommodations, kitchens, showers, a hospital, administrative offices, a brothel, and other buildings, again with limited access for the inmates, constituted by their rank in the camp hierarchy. The navigation through the space was organized via strict routine, beginning with the roll calls in the early morning, the work shift, and the eating breaks. The largest systemic imbalance in terms of maintaining one's well-being was the work overload that was amplified by the insufficient opportunities to recharge the physical batteries through nourishment and sleep. Same applied to the spiritual batteries. The camp was not offering an endpoint to the current miserable situation and leaving one to the unknown, quote, devoid of any foundation, unquote. The hammering rhythm of life was defined by Ausrücken and Einrücken, words that Levi borrowed from the military jargon of the camp guards, so moving in and moving out. He compared the camp to a garrison of soldiers, with the exception that the inmates were fighting for their lives in a concentrated space and not with an expansionist agenda like soldiers. But they all shared the same restlessness and an uncertainty about the future. It was exactly the structural organization of the camp which was designed to strategically maintain a tension of existential uncertainty and physical hunger, which defined its nature. It was a space not designed for living, but for leaving, for fading away into an anonymous death by hunger, disease, labor, and murder for the inmate, and into a heroic death chiseled into the granite of triumphal arches for the soldiers. Both were dying on soils that knew nothing about the blood and soil ideology that mobilized all of these bodies to rush towards their deaths. Death is a transition from verticality into horizontality in terms of posture. And from there, the remains of the body travel downwards, sooner or later, while the spirits, if they exist, might go upwards. The toil of keeping an erect posture to put one step after the other was especially heavy within the confines of the camps. The Aryans were supposed to be transformed into Kriegsmaschinen, war machines, the non-Aryans into Sterbemaschinen, death machines. Quote, the lager was a great machine to reduce us to beasts. We must walk erect without dragging our feet, not in homage to Prussian discipline, but to remain alive, not to begin to die, unquote. Meanwhile, the military machines whose bodies were doing the Tötungsarbeit, murder work, were fighting against the enemy's bodies. And they are, quote, there are 10,000 and they are a single gray machine. They are exactly determined. They do not think and they do not desire, they walk, unquote. The Sterbemaschinen, so the ones, the dying machines who did the dying work, were fighting with their own bodies due to the, quote, prescribed chronic hunger unknown to free man, which makes one dream at night and settles in all the limbs of the body, unquote, until, quote, my body is not longer mine. My belly is swollen, my limbs emaciated, my face is thick in the morning, hollow in the evening. Some of us have yellow skin, others gray. When we do not meet for a few days, we hardly recognize each other, unquote. It was in this exhausted state of mind that Levi developed a relationship to the substructure of the camp, the soils in all its complexities, which he described in much detail. He felt that, quote, the entire hut shakes to its foundations, unquote, when the early morning activity in the barrack roughly awoke him from his restless dreams, when everybody rushed to get bread. He faced it in the dirty latrines with, quote, the floor covered by a layer of mud, unquote. He sank into the ground during work, quote, bending underneath the load, arms hanging down one side, not speaking, unquote. When the weight of stones, iron casts, and sandbags was bearing on his whole heavy load-bearing body from the shoulders as pressure points, distributing the weight downwards, distributing the weight downwards. The critical element for the human apparatus to survive these endless work shifts was the body's connecting point to the soils, so the part it is walking upon. The shoes wrapped around the human foot as a protective shield and where signs of wear and tear occur most frequently. It was there where the overarching exhaustion of the overall apparatus surfaced first. Levi described one instance in which a piece of metal fell down and, quote, cut across the back of my foot, unquote. The accident forced him to enter the Krankenbau, the hospital, short KB, a space of regeneration that many never left again. When he took off his shoe, he saw his foot, quote, is full of blood, by now congealed and kneaded into the mud and rags of the cloth I found a month ago, and which I use as a footpad, unquote. Here he described one of the moments in which his blood was absorbed by soil and offers a new semantic complexity of the abstract formula blood and Boden, blood and soil. The soil mixing with his blood forged a new type of blood and soil, maybe blood and earth, and offers us a different narrative to remap these terms, to claim them back and remap German soils more concretely and intimately. When we look at the soils as soaked with the blood of the victims, we are dismantling the abstract camp of Germania and thus are narratively nourishing the empty ideological shells of blood and soil. It was the blood of the marching soldiers and camp inmates which colored the clean, well-lit, symmetrical Germania maps and models of Speer in a deep red and brown tone, just like in one of these collages by an artist. Apart from that moment, Levi described the swampy mud in which one's feet got stuck during the rainy seasons, the hard frozen soils during winter, the digging of earth pits, the feces that had to be carried from the barracks to the earth holes, the trembling grounds during air raids, and probably more that I forgot. All of these moments summit a spectrum of different consistencies of soils and the experiences people had with them, which are adding to the complex texture of a Germanist that is rooted in flowing bloods and moving soils. They allowed us to look at the fascist impregnation logic of spirit, body, stone, and earth within a different network of association that goes beyond or beneath Speer's realm of ideas, who believed that Hitler needed to witness his buildings to pass on his spirit to them before he died. The latter was to manifest itself in the city of Germania, an attempt to ban the static idea of blood and soil into stone and freeze the natural mobility of narratives of spaces, times, and identities. The heavy load-bearing cylinder as the interface between the fascist super and substructure offers the ideal site of intervention to the static fascist meta-narrative by reinscribing the foundation of suffering it was built upon in the form of a cultural geological narrative that layers architectural philosophy, history of science and technology, Holocaust memory, and is open to more layers to be added. Instead of preparing the erection of the gate of Germania in form of the triumphal arch, it can be an entrance point to dive into and explore the complexity of memory. Levi was one of the many existing voices I chose to illustrate my approach with, but it would be worthwhile and necessary to gather a more representative spectrum of the accounts of the victims to show the full potential of a cultural geological approach in the future. This was hardly the groundwork, maybe the first shovel digging into the soils beyond Germanness. That's it.
All for that very rich presentation. The floor is now open for questions, comments, discussion. And you all have a mic on your tables, so please just feel free to grab one and let's have a conversation.
On? Yep. Well, that was grim. And partly through your elaborate insights, so meticulously documented. So I certainly want to say I appreciate it. My question is revolves around other load-bearing monuments that were mentioned in the superlatives at the beginning. You know, the Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty, the pyramids, and so on and so forth. Are all of these monuments associated with visions of grandeur of a similar scale that are representing the legacy of a fanatic individual who wants to be remembered in history for something that's going to be monumental and visible by many? So, and I realize, of course, that all of those examples come from many different cultures, but you've gone into great detail on this one or this set of buildings that Speer designed for Hitler. But there was such kind of a rich association between the grand vision of Hitler and Speer being willing to put this into a monumental memory or structure. I'm just wondering, do you think there's a similar association with other buildings of that nature or monuments of that nature?
Yes, so I think how I try to communicate this is that this kind of dream of grandeur is something that is nested within humanity, and it starts maybe with Sumerian ziggurats, and maybe ends with trying with space rockets to colonize Mars. So this expansionist drive of going further and further, there is something that is within us, but just like Klaus Heinrich says, he's one of the founders of the Freie Universität Berlin, and he grew up while Speer was kind of messing up Berlin. He said that we have to be aware of this kind of expansionist drive within us to keep it in check. Rather than just suppressing it or shying away from it, we have to engage with it in order to not become overly destructive. And well, the monuments that you mentioned, yes, they come from all different cultures, and the Eiffel Tower is had a very complicated foundation design too. So yeah, there's many overlaps, but I think what Julia Hell put it actually quite great in her book. She said that German fascism distinguishes itself from other cultures by being the most violent in its methods to achieve its goal. Yeah. I hope this answers the question to a certain part. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I also so appreciated this talk as fascinating as a German person to whom this is unfortunately much too familiar. And I'm particularly interested also in this engineering cultural history. I mean, that's what I find is the really exciting aspect of the talk to me. Again, otherwise, unfortunately, too familiar. And tableite, of course, is something that I also read in university settings. So it's really interesting to encounter it here in Michigan, right? So this is such an important text at the time, and something I don't read much here because it has such a very specific German feeling to it, but yet a kind of hydraulic cultural history that would have interesting application elsewhere. But the idea of an alien cultural history, I wonder whether this is in a way a sharpening of the previous question, does that kind of engineering cultural history exist in similar ways in other cultural frameworks? So this is less about whether monuments and history exist in other places, because of course they do, that kind of specific analysis of engineering as a cultural activity, I'm just particularly interested, of course, here in a US context, right, where immediately I think more of a spatial expansion that goes sideways. Rather than depth-wise, I'm immediately thinking about space grabbing this way. I don't think that there's something you can point to it. And in a UK context and in a the kind of British Empire context, I immediately think about waterworks. I think about Kingdom. The guy's the strange name. Isambard Kingdom. Brunel, thank you. Brunel. Think about people like that and their engineering cultural enterprises. Are there US engineers that have a similar kind of cultural hole in the imagination that you can refer us to?
Well, we have an engineer in the room. I don't know how extensive his historiographical approach is. Well, I'm basically writing about geotechnical engineering, and there's not much material there. It seems like they're interested in their history, because I talked to the ones here in Michigan. I talked to 3 faculty members, and they're very interested in what I'm doing, and they even have some historical documents at their office that I can look at, because the discipline was founded by one particular guy. His name was Karl Terzaghi from Austria, but he was mostly in Harvard, I think, or MIT. So for me to kind of stitch together this cultural history of engineering, I had to go to the primary sources. I engaged a lot with the history of the German Society for Soil Mechanics, because they had almost unlimited funding due to Speer, a certain era in history. And then there's this guy, Karl-Eugen Kurek, he's German. Well, he wrote this book, From Arch Analysis to Computational Mechanics. And there's some parts on geotechnical engineering, and there was a French geotechnical engineer, Jean Kérisel, who wrote extensively. Well, he wrote a few books on the history of geotechnical engineering, and he has a really broad perspective, because he starts with the Sumerians and then goes to the present. So it seems like for that, there were no American scholars I read. Yeah, but there's someone at University of Rochester who just wrote a great book about, well, mining, which is also kind of subterranean engineering, or whatever they call it. It's something with steel, modernity, coal, or something like that. He's at the University of Rochester. Christensen is his last name. Yeah. You're welcome. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was sort of struck by the way that you moved so fluently from the sort of physicality and the sort of technical aspects through to the kind of cultural resonances. And I guess I have a rather maybe simplistic question, but I'm curious whether people moving around in Berlin today would be conscious of those resonances, as well as simply the physicality of the environment.
So the cylinder, and this is one of the reasons I'm writing this book, is pretty much under the radar still. So many people who are from Berlin don't know about it. It is a memorial site, so you can visit it, I think 3 days a week, or it kind of fluctuates a little bit. But there's free tours every Sunday at 3 p.m. offered by the Museums Temple of Schöneberg. And who really started this was an architect who worked for a community organization, Berlin Underworld, Berlin Unterwelten, and they are looking at bunkers and flag towers and all kinds of things. So people don't know enough about it, but there's a lot of remnants from that time. Yeah, so I hope that answers some of the questions.
Well, actually, that just to follow up, I mean, from reading your materials, apparently you have been doing some of that public humanities work as well, right? Can you talk a little bit about what your own involvement has been in terms of educating the public, either in Germany or elsewhere?
Yeah, so I'm kind of trying to build up this track record of public humanities, which is a buzzword now. But I gave a talk at this community organization I just mentioned, Berliner Unterwelten. They're in charge of bunkers and all structures from all different from the former from the GDR, from the fascist time, from all different periods, and they're offering tours and they're preserving things. And I gave a live stream talk on the cylinder that is now on YouTube, and yeah, now I will be on this podcast. That they're making an episode just on the cylinder. So they approached me while I was at the Max Planck Institute this summer in Berlin. I was at a workshop with soil scientists and landscape architects and like interdisciplinary crowd, and we are now publishing this as, I think it will be open source and kind of, it's an academic press, but it's supposed to be broadly accessible. So yes, I think it's important in my case to kind of branch out of the ivory tower of academia that looks kind of nice. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. You know? Yeah. Okay, great. The question is kind of inspired by archaeological work. When oftentimes when we look at ancient sites and we read archaeologists who discuss ancient sites, one of the things that they often say is, well, there's nothing to find here because the people who were here took materials, reconstituted them somewhere else, and built something new, right? And this makes our site now inaccessible, difficult to work with. It disrupts the stratigraphy of the site. The kind of scientific merit of it is now compromised. The question is more broadly about Germania as a project. As it happened historically, this megalomaniac project, right, didn't happen, and then Berlin is reconstituted after the war. When it was supposed to be Germania, was the idea that you blow up Berlin as it exists and you build it out of the material that you destroyed, you create something new, or you import all this materials and you create something new in place, right? And this is, I think, a very important question from the point of view of, as you bring it up, fascist metaphysics even, right? Because are you reconstituting something that is in place into something? Are you importing something new that is completely new? And if you could talk about this as it was planned, perhaps, that would be very interesting, at least for me to hear about.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, while there were thousands of buildings built in Berlin during the Nazi period, none of them were really part of the Germania project. The cylinder was supposed to disappear after 20 weeks. The new chancellery was built. That was actually part of the planning, but it was taken down after the war. And whilst not that many buildings were built, a lot was actually destroyed, though. So the plan was to knock down 50,000 apartments during a housing crisis. So there was a lot of movement going on. There's a great book about how this whole resettlement project, as they called it, went on. Susanne Willems wrote that book, Der entsiedelte Jude, the resettled Jew. So they tried to knock down 50,000 apartments, and they knocked actually down 15,000, which is still quite a lot. So whole quarters were taken down. So the counterpiece to the Triumphal Arch would have been this Great Hall. I have it here. And the Great Hall which would have had the 17-fold volume of the St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. And it would have been the foundation would have been like 1,000 by 1,000 feet, the square. And in order to do that, they had to start early. So they started even before they made the cylinder. And so they knocked down the so-called Eisenviertel, it was a quarter of Berlin that had a lot of beautiful mansions, historic mansions, because all the diplomats were housed there. So that was knocked down completely. And then, yes, they started in the south of Berlin, close to the cylinder, where they had the biggest plans. Obviously, where was it here? Yeah, this is Berlin, and this was kind of the centerpiece of the whole planning. So they started here and they started here, but also, of course, then the war was happening and Berlin was being bombed. So Speer pivoted from building this to, well, organizing the German military apparatus. So he was producing ammunition and bombs, and with Werner von Braun, who later went to NASA, he made rockets. But there's this quote by Speer that he appreciated the Allied bombings because they were doing his job. They were kind of knocking down Berlin so that he can build this. Yeah. So Germania was this kind of past future or the speculative future, but it had really real life consequences. And for example, just for the marble and the granite and all of the stones, several concentration camps were just chosen because there were stones for Speer. So people died, and they built Europe's largest brick factory close to Berlin in Oranienburg, and Hitler worked a lot with SS. So he didn't build a lot, but he destroyed a lot of life and a lot of architecture and ground and all of kinds of things. Yeah, hope that answers some of the question. Yeah.
Why is a cylinder the optimal structure to test load bearing of soil when the structures you talked about, like the triumphal arch and the hall, they're not cylinders?
Yeah, good question. I assume that since an arch is built on pillars, they were probably, so this has 1, 2, 3, 4 pillars at least. So one of the conclusions of the engineer who worked on this, Heinz Moos, he said that they were working on a circular foundation. So I assume that the cylinder probably simulated also the shape of the anticipated foundation design. They didn't know yet, but they came to the conclusion later on that they will probably build a circular foundation and densify the soil. So I assume that's why they chose that shape. Yeah, but I don't know exactly. They didn't talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating and insightful. I want to mention that I actually realized I lived 5 minutes from the cylinder. I've passed it hundreds of times and had no idea it existed. But my main question is, so you also said that this was also a change in engineering and measurement. And were there any insights gained from this, not just for Germania, but generally for engineering that are still being used? And if so, is this something where there's kind of a yucky association with that? Because that's often the problem, like in medical sciences and neuroscience and so forth, that a lot of the insights came through abusing people or doing something that was ethically not is not appreciated anymore.
Yeah, so the so-called technological transfer was quite heavy. One of the one soil engineer in a leading position in Berlin said that up to 70 to 80% of knowledge we have on foundation engineering and soil mechanics comes from this one site. That's probably an exaggeration, but there are building norms that are still in place, which means they're being updated. One of them, DIN 1045 and 54. They're still in place and they kind of regulate, because Germany is very regulated. They regulate how to build on soils like this. And the data was used for power plants, for heavy things. So, but you also have to say that so after the end of the war, this thing, it had a break for about a year, and then the German Society of Soil Mechanics, that was then part of the Technical University, they continued their experiments on site until the 1980s. So it was highly productive, but what they did most, what you can't see here, but so when you go there now, there's this kind of, they dug out this hole, and what they did is they used the cylinder as a dead weight because it's this massive object. So they had the cylinder, and then they had space in between the cylinder and the ground. They put some like a strip foundation on the ground made out of a new material, let's say a new innovative carbon-induced, they probably didn't have that, but they had some new type of ferroconcrete, and then they had this press, and the press kind of simulated pressure. And since you have such a heavy object, you can simulate almost infinite pressure. So that's how they used it. And when you go into the archive, they get letters from Norway, from Australia, from Japan, from all over the world, and they all want that data because it's such a unique testing site. And until it wasn't in the 1980s. Yeah. So yes, there's a lot of data that's still being used, and it was used then for all kinds of things, the Hansa-Viertel skyscrapers, many things, yeah. I have a large footnote, I think, in my manuscript somewhere where I list some of these things from the archive. I think it's not a footnote anymore, and it's now in the text. Yeah.
I'm very curious as to how you came upon this project. Did you like grow up in the neighborhood? I'm just curious, how does one discover a project like this?
Yeah, no, I did not grow up in the neighborhood at all. I'm from Munich, so I'm from Bavaria, and people from Berlin don't like people from Munich. So I came across this. I read my first book on Speer when I was a teenager. It was this book called Speer und Er. It was about the relationship between Hitler and Speer. So I was always remotely interested in the topic, but I started my dissertation as, and this might not come as a surprise, as a genealogy of the Tower of Babel motif in German modernity. So I was writing about kind of how fluid the transition from ambition and megalomania to destruction is. And I wanted to write on text, but also buildings and tower-esque buildings. So this, to me, looked like an inverted tower because it kind of goes into the ground, right? We have it somewhere here. And then I figured out that this is the most important part of my project. And also this other project covered 200 years or so it was too much for dissertation. And then I just actually my advisor had mentioned this cylinder somewhere in a book called Hypercities Berlin, where he digitized a lot of maps, thick maps, and maybe that was the first time I heard of it. But I kind of put the pieces together, then Speer and all of this. So yeah. But I started with Germanistic, like in Germany, you become a Goethe expert or whatever, and from studying beautiful things, I came to ugly things, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions, thoughts, comments? Do you have any concluding thoughts for us or the ambitions with this project as you go forward? I'm sorry? Oh, there's a chat. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
That's Gene territory or your
Gene?
territory. That's not mine.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It was an earlier message.
Yeah,
Okay, all right.
yeah.
Do you have any concluding?
Maybe Anne, can you tell us something about glacial till?
Okay. Okay. There you go.
Yeah, no, I talked to Paul about this after he presented at the lunch seminar, and I find it incredibly, I guess, poetic that they were creating these very hubristic plans on possibly the least stable geologic, surface they could, because and after I talked to Paul about it, he was asking me, oh, would you expect all this irregularity in the soil? And I said, no, normally you would expect to see the layers kind of continuing horizontally for a long distance. That's really the basic principle of geology we base a lot of assumptions on. But glacial till breaks all those assumptions because it's this huge mixture that glaciers basically bulldoze into an area, including what we're sitting on. So you get, sands and then massive boulders in them. And I even had heard a story of a building in Minnesota that basically they thought they were building on bedrock, but it turned out they were just building on a massive boulder sitting glacial till. And it almost, the mechanical testing, I guess the other thing that struck me was I took a hydrogeology class, which is about how groundwater moves. And we had, the first lecture was this guy who was very theoretical and talked about the water moving through soil, as the soil is this very homogeneous medium where you can very regularly predict using mathematics where water is going to travel. And then the second professor came in and said, none of that works because no soil is homogeneous like that. You just have to go out and directly measure it, and it's going to be totally irregular. So I kind of think about that with this project as the sort of fluidity you talked about, and especially as appropriate for glacial till. Yeah.
Yeah, this is what's so great about the Society of Fellows, then. I can just talk to a geologist, or, well, now it seems like maybe also an astrophysicist, and they can prove or disapprove of my fancy humanities-esque reading.
Oh, I did. So I have not seen this movie, but it does seem like Megalopolis would be a good watch for you, from what I hear. Also, is my other thought.
Yeah, I think it's showing now. Yeah. Okay.
Well, with that, maybe you should thank Paul for his presentation, and thank you all for being here tonight. And look forward to the next event.